So first of all, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Before I get to introduce the amazing Melissa Connelly, just these lunch and learns are things we do every once in a while, sometimes just for staff. Sometimes we open it up to partners and friends. And this is one I thought that partners and friends would actually enjoy. We're putting together another that's going to be from a school, a lab at the school called the Brainwave Learning Center. It's a neuroscience lab in partnership with Stanford University. That'll be coming to you the next week or two. So hopefully you'll be able to make that as well. So let me get to Melissa. So Melissa was the headliner at the Gates All Hands meeting last year. OneGoal has been doing amazing work, frankly, in supporting young people, especially kids who are historically systematically excluded. It's the terminology we use here at Digital Promise. I first heard of OneGoal when I was at Gates. Bob Hughes and others just couldn't stop talking about this amazing work. And of course, for my days in Chicago, I heard of Melissa Connelly, but of course, got to see and hear about the work. I thought you all would enjoy, frankly, the amazing work that she's doing. Just so you know, when you think about the transition from secondary to post-secondary, it is a cliff for a lot of kids. Even the ones who graduate high school are accepted to college, often don't come. And I tell people often, I live P16. I have a daughter who just finished Loyola University in Chicago. And as an educator, I had a hell of a time, frankly, managing the process of transition from high school to post-secondary. Got into a fight with her guidance counselor when she was in high school. We actually had to call the superintendent. But luckily, the job I had at the time allowed me to call the superintendent and basically tell him, this is what the hell's going on in your high school. And he was completely aghast as to what he experienced. But this young woman was left crying after her only meeting as a senior in high school. The good news, frankly, is that she just graduated, 3.98, and heading to graduate school in the next year. So I'm not going to steal the thunder and leave Melissa to talk to us about the amazing work she's doing in Chicago and around the country. Melissa, over to you.
One of these days, I'm going to get through an introduction without blushing. That was incredibly humbling. Thank you so much. For those of you that don't know, if you live in Chicago or anywhere near Chicago, our friend Jean-Claude is education famous and has left quite the legacy. And so it feels very much like just a full circle, really beautiful moment for me to be in this space with you all. I'm also a huge fan of the work that you all have been doing at Digital Promise. So let me just start with gratitude. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for welcoming me into this space today. I am and will always be a classroom teacher, educator first. And I'm not going to lie, when I saw we had 90 minutes together, the first thing I thought about is what I learned in my early teaching courses that, typically your attention span is 1 minute for every 1 year you've been on the planet. And so assuming that there's not, looking at the faces, a lot of 90-year-old plus folks here, I'm going to try really, really hard to not make this everyone just listening to me for the next 90 minutes, but hopefully real discourse and an opportunity for dialogue. I'm a firm believer in, any time you create space for learning, it should feel multi-directional. And so I'm hoping, you all will be able to share with me and push our ideas and affirm what you hear that we're doing that you think is working and, push us on areas that we could be stronger. Because of that, I've asked my colleague, Stephen, to join us today, and he's going to help make this space feel more like a conversation by elevating anything that comes through in the chat, whether it's a question or a reaction, so that it is more of a conversation. I know it's a big group, but we're going to really try and bring several voices into the room. But with that, let me actually just take a second and allow Stephen to introduce himself before we jump in.
Thanks so much, Melissa. It's really nice to meet all of you. Director of Communications here at OneGoal. I've been here since October of 2021, so year and a half. But I've been in nonprofits for about 15 years, doing the work of marketing and communications. Was in social service before, and found out about OneGoal in 2018, and it really stuck in my head because I was a first-gen student from a low-income community in Kansas, And I just thought as soon as something opens there, I'm going to go for it. So it's a bit of a dream come true to join Melissa and the team at OneGoal. And yeah, I'm excited to hear from you today, Melissa.
Thanks, Stephen. All right, so we will jump in. Jean-Claude and I actually had dinner recently where he was sharing this approach to lunch and learns, which I thought was just incredible and such a great way to model that we are all still learning. It doesn't matter how long we've been in social justice education. It's important that we create space to continue to share ideas and make each other better and stronger. And when I thought about what I might be able to offer to this space, there's a part of the OneGoal story that, you know, we share with all of our funders, all of our champions about our impact, about the outcomes that we've achieved over the last 15 years. But there's, I think, a more nuanced and important story to tell about what it looks like to take the work of community organizers, community leaders, truly people who are most deeply impacted by many of the issues that we are signing up to solve, and really build upon those ideas and that work and those efforts, not to be in competition or to work counter to, but to truly elevate the work that's happening locally in every community in every country, and truly to figure out ways to deepen impact and broaden impact by leveraging the capabilities of nonprofits and our broader philanthropic community. And so this construct of what it looks like to go from Silas, who is an incredible community organizer, or was, he passed away in about 15 years ago, and really started this effort around excellence in post-secondary advising for historically, systematically excluded young people across the city of Chicago, and to take those ideas and make it a true movement across our country. And so excited to dig into that story and some of the insights that we've learned over the last 15 plus years. Before I tell the OneGoal story, I just wanted to share a little bit about who I am and why I do this work. So a few images here for you. This beautiful woman in the center of these two photographs you see on your screen. One with my own children, that's Aday and Ashland, who are now 16 and 14 years old. And then a picture with me down in the center with Mrs. Jeter. So Mrs. Jeter was my high school social worker. When I started freshman year, I went for my orientation to pick up my class schedule and my books. And when I received my schedule, I saw a lot that I would expect to see, like math and science and English. But then I saw a course called TAP. And in my naivete at 14 years old, I thought, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know they offered tap dancing classes. It is part of the high school curriculum. So I went to my counselor and asked why I was registered for tap dance. And she said, oh, no, that's truancy abatement program. So I had been automatically enrolled in a truancy abatement program for youth who had missed more than 50 days of 8th grade. And the program, the way it was designed, which I'm sure you can all see why it's incredibly flawed, was that it would take the place of a credit-bearing course. Meaning if you were a truant kid, there was no way you could actually graduate high school on time because you were already behind in accruing the appropriate credits that you would need. So your first period class would be TAP, and there would be a police officer there, and he would check attendance. And for anybody who didn't show up, he would send a police car to your house to pick you up and to bring you to school. And then once you got there, you sat around for 45 minutes throughout first period until the next class came. And so as I sort of started to make peace, or as much as I could, with the label of being a TAP kid, because that's exactly what it felt like, and tried to fully understand what that meant for my future, I realized that there was actually one benefit to this program, and that was I was automatically assigned a social worker who I had to meet with regularly. That social worker was Mrs. Jeter. And after about 3 meetings with her, she pulled me aside and said, "You do not belong in TAP. Do you want to be out of it?" And I said, "Yes, please. Like, what do I have to do?" And in that moment, she told me exactly who I needed to talk to, what I needed to say, when they would tell me no, who I needed to talk to after them. So she was teaching me how to navigate the incredibly bureaucratic and honestly unjust system that is our education system, so that I would have a fair shot at actually graduating high school on time and potentially going on to college. Mrs. Jeter became one of my sheroes. I met with her literally every single day of high school. I would just pop by her office right at 2:35 when the bell rang. Sometimes I would come in tears. Sometimes I would stay in her office because I didn't want to go home. At the time, I had my mom was battling drug addiction issues. I was helping raise my younger siblings, had an incredibly emotionally and physically abusive stepfather. And so Miss Jeter became in many ways a second home to me. I share that because when I learned about the work that was happening at OneGoal, it made sense, because when I heard that there was an opportunity for educators to become part of the support system in helping students really transition successfully to adulthood, not just teach curriculum, but really to help our young people grow up, I realized that that's what Ms. Jeter did to me. It wasn't called OneGoal. There wasn't a structure. She didn't have curriculum. She didn't have data. She didn't have tools. It wasn't part of her job. But the work of OneGoal in really aiding young people through this transition to adulthood and hopefully college or career was part of my secondary experience in a way that I believe it should be part of the secondary experience for all young people. And so in so many ways, OneGoal for me, while it is, can be complex or hard to really get, for me, it immediately made sense, because what Ms. Jeter did for me is what we hope to do for young people across the country. So you might hear me refer to Mrs. Jeter as sort of my ideal, what a strong support system for young people look like, because that I know is what changed not just my life, but honestly the lives of my 2 babies, Ade and Ashland. In preparation for today, I spent some time with Jean-Claude just digging into what sounds like you are sort of a frame the work that you are all familiar with or have referenced at various points throughout the last few years. And it's this P through 16 student pathways data, which, whether you call it, I know folks have referred to it as the leaky pipeline of the education system, but what is clear from this data is that we are losing students or actively pushing out students at really critical milestones throughout their adolescence and early adulthood. And when you look at this data, I think all of us would have, I would hope, a similar reaction and see that this is incredibly concerning. And then on the next slide, when you actually narrow in on what it looks like for students who are growing up in poverty, who have access to free and reduced lunch, it turns from concerning to what I would describe as tragic, right? When we see single-digit degree attainment and know that degree attainment is one of the greatest proxies we have to a family sustaining wage. And it is just that, it is a proxy. It is not, at least in the OneGoal's terms, the be all end all in terms of what we would want for our young people. But it is a pretty good proxy. And to know that the realities for many of our young people is that we will see 8% of our students achieve a bachelor's degree, when we know that upwards of 80% of students pretty consistently, no matter what research you look at, actually aspire to have a 4-year degree. It is that aspiration and reality, or aspiration and outcomes gap, that OneGoal is focused on directly trying to close. I wanted to just give a brief snapshot of, you know, what OneGoal's story has looked like. So we started in 2007 in Chicago, originally as an after-school program that was founded by a group of 24, 25-year-old young people who happened to all be sharing an apartment. And it was a fifth grade teacher, a high school principal, and a social entrepreneur who turns out are the perfect combination of folks to build a nonprofit. And, you know, now more than 15 years later, have expanded to become a national organization who is not just offering direct program services, but helping to equip school systems, large districts, and full states with the tools, resources, capabilities that they need to completely reimagine the way we support our young people into adulthood. I will say, when I look at this slide, there's something that feels wrong to me. There's something that feels a little bit off. And Stephen, I know you're on the Marcom team, so you're going to have to just earmuffs for a second, because I know there's a little bit of judgment in this. But I personally, as a Black woman who grew up on the South Side of Chicago, I think it's so important that we tell the story of our ancestors. We tell the story of those who came before us, because OneGoal is a nonprofit, and, you know, was founded by a Teach for America 24-year-old alum. But the reality is, we have leveraged the brilliance, the sweat, the tears of those who came before us to really be able to start a programmatic model that we knew would have impact. And so I'm going to let you see just a quick glimpse into what we saw in our city as a result of Silas Purnell. One just trigger warning for all of you out there. I know that when we refer to our students, we typically use asset-based language, historically systematically excluded, but you will hear some pretty outdated ways to describe young people communities. So just please know that that's not a representation of us, but of the past.
Word of mouth leads them through these battered steel doors to the promise of a better life, made possible by a tireless 72-year-old man named Silas Purnell.
Where are you in school now?
Nowhere.
His mission for the past 27 years has been to convince college administrators all over the land to grant scholarships to young men and women who didn't quite fit the standard college profile, despite learning everything there is to know about
unemployment, poor housing, poor health care, teenage pregnancy, drugs, gangs, and I can go on and on. The one thing that can change all of that is education.
Nor do you find many people like Silas Purnell, who has turned the government-funded Ada S. McKinley Community Service Center into the busiest college placement office in the country.
Texas Southern will take you.
By writing, calling, even visiting hundreds of college presidents, Silas Purnell has finagled scholarships for over 40,000 people. Some have become doctors like Constance Shabazz, or business leaders like Adrian Brooks. His files are filled with stories of people who simply weren't supposed to make it off these streets.
Take, for example, the case of one young woman who scored only a 4 out of a possible 36 on a college placement exam. Her improbable dream was to go to the University of Illinois, and she came to Silas Purnell for help.
I said, but your level of preparation don't match what they want for you to be admitted to the University of Illinois. She said, Mr. Purnell, you know about my level of preparation, but you don't know about my level of desperation. I'm in the street already. I can't go nowhere but up.
He twisted some arms, got her accepted, and she graduated in 4 years.
Are we ready for you?
The colleges underwrite the scholarships, but it's Silas and his friends who scrape together money for books, clothes, meals, and plane tickets, although never the round-trip variety.
No, don't ever waste your money giving the student a round-trip ticket, because he'd be itching to use that other half. Ship him out one way and pray for him.
He's gruff and recalcitrant and will give you the shirt off his back.
A gift appreciated for generations to come.
They always turn to him and say, "Thank you, Mr. Purnell. What can I do to help you?" And Silas every time turns towards them and he says, "Help someone else."
Most people in the mainstream world have never heard of Silas Purnell, but to 40,000 inner-city souls who couldn't have gone to college without his help, he's a legendary figure who has proven without a doubt
that there are no lost causes.
I'll be there in a few minutes.
For today, Mike Leonard, NBC News, Chicago.
Peter S. McKinnon. See why he walking in the green jacket? Right there. Just go right around there.
Word of mouth leads them through these battered steel.
I'm so glad that we get this setting to share that story, because that I think we sometimes forget to honor our history and our roots and our ancestors. And I can't listen to or watch Silence without a huge smile on my face, because I know OneGoal would not be here truly without his works. And it was interesting when I joined staff in 2014. I knew the story of Silas Purnell as a Chicagoan, and there was a moment where my CEO at the time, Jeff Nelson, asked me if I would be interested in writing a reflection on Black History Month. And so I used it as an opportunity to talk about Silas and his work. And when I sent out this message, this reflection to all staff, I immediately got a reply from my CEO at the time, Jeff. And he said, "Gosh, this is so profound." He goes, "I don't think you know this, but when we founded OneGoal, we contacted Silas's former students and we got input and advice from his students on our curriculum, that we actually structured our curriculum based on their experience and what they said worked and what helped." And he attributed a lot of what makes OneGoal unique and different to really how Silas oriented. As you can see, he got a lot of head and he had a lot of heart. And I think one of the things that has made OneGoal a different place to work for me, a different type of experience for our young people, is because it is such a beautiful combination of heart and head. And I really think that that is the direct result of Silas's legacy. So I'm going to fast forward in this story and this journey quite a bit. So, you know, Silas, the legacy suggests, or as the fairy tale goes, you know, he single-handedly sent 60,000 students to college who ultimately completed, which is remarkable if you think about the power of a singular individual with that kind of vision and collective will. And yet, the reality is, in 2006, when you looked across our city and our system, we were not necessarily seeing the impact at the system level that you would hope was happening as a result of Silas's work. And so this image that you see here was the front page of the Chicago Tribune in 2006. And it was burned in my brain, as well as I'm sure the brain of any educator who lived in or around Chicago at the time. So those black shaded in figures that you see represent the 6 out of every 100 CPS students who at that point would earn a degree or credential by age 25. And you know, there's this moment where I feel like if I could take you all back to 2006 in Chicago, where there was just a collective sort of sigh of despair in our city, because we all thought, well, what are we doing? Right? At the time I was teaching 5th grade, and my founder and predecessor, who now still sits on my board, was also teaching 5th grade, actually less than 4 blocks away from me at the time. And the way that he tells the story is that after reading this, he fell into a pretty deep depression because he had to go to school and look at his 32 5th graders and, you know, pick out the 1 or 2 for whom the promises that he had been offering about, if you work hard, then you will succeed, would actually come to fruition. And then the, you know, additional 30 students that for whom that would not be the reality given this data, and decided within months that, you know, he couldn't sit idly by and allow that to happen. And then OneGoal was born. And it truly was born as an experiment with This high school principal you see here, Matt King, who was on the south side of Chicago, offered to allow at that time urban students empowered, which, fun fact, us empowered was probably one of the worst decisions we collectively made at some point, because a lot of teachers and students thought we were saying Austin Powers, not us empowered. Fun fact about OneGoal, hence the rebrand. And we recognize that building an after-school program accomplished a lot. It accomplished the opportunity for students to not truly treat the work of asking the question of what do you want to be when you grow up as an afterthought, but as a central experience to something that we feel like was a question that everybody should be asking themselves. The challenge became all of the things that I'm sure you can imagine. An after-school program, there's automatically selection bias because you're unintentionally ruling out the students who have to go to work or have to care for younger siblings and can't commit to that kind of time and resource to an after-school program. I think the other part that I've reflected a lot about since then is that it still sends the message that advising in the social emotional development of our young people into adults is somehow an extracurricular activity and not core to the secondary experience for every adolescent. And so after 3 years of working with students in this sort of lab environment, turned OneGoal into an in-school model. And so there are 4 components of the work that we did throughout our first decade as an organization. The first key differentiator of our work, relative to a lot of work that had happened previously across our city, is that we engaged educators. So we certainly had paid attention to the phenomenon that when outcomes were shifting, almost always educators were part of the equation. And so we recognize that, counselors are critical in our schools, and there are so few of them. And often, it relegated to a back office in the high school experience where students are lucky if they get one session. There's a really alarming stat that the average high school student receives 38 minutes of advising. 38 minutes. So you can imagine what you can accomplish and what you cannot possibly accomplish in 38 minutes of advising a young person. And so we needed to really put educators and other adults at the center of the experience of supporting our young people. We also recognized that we needed to think about students' pathways as diverse and really center on what their aspirations were for themselves, and then provide real data to practitioners to continue to aid and support their journey. And then last but certainly not least, and this is an area of our work that we really have evolved considerably over time, that there needed to be components of this work that went above and beyond the more transactional parts of the post-secondary planning process, like FAFSA and essays and applications, which we know all need to happen. But at the end of the day, if you don't believe you are going to be something when you grow up, then why complete the FAFSA? And so we needed to really ensure that we were focusing and centering the curriculum on ensuring that young people felt good about themselves, that could see a future for themselves. I can tell you personally, I didn't at 15 as a truant student, and it took Ms. Jeter helping me see something in myself that I couldn't yet see in order to get there. I'm going to pause here. Stephen, I just want to see if there's anything that's coming up in the chat or anything that, any questions or things that you would like me to emphasize before we go on to where we went from here.
Not so far questions, but please, folks, feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I can surface those to Melissa. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the dynamic between, the school counselors and the sort of the ratios that we're dealing with, and why we're getting so little time. Because I think that's something a lot of folks say as well. There's someone in the schools providing that function, the college and career centers, the counselors, but what are they up against, and what is the vacuum we were trying to fill?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So a couple of reflections there. I mean, so first, I think most people are familiar, the average counselor to student ratio nationally is about 400. I think it's currently 470 to 1, somewhere around there. And so you can imagine having 400 plus, 500 plus students on your caseload, and then that same leaky pipeline data that we opened with, you can imagine, and we've actually done this work alongside of Chicago Public Schools, when you even just map the counselor to student ratio by neighborhood in Chicago, you see incredible variation, probably unsurprisingly associated with neighborhoods that are more economically disadvantaged. And so what we see is that in Lincoln Park, a wealthier community in Chicago, even in the same school district, we were seeing ratios closer to 250 to 1, whereas in Austin, in the west side of Chicago, we saw counselor to student ratios over 700 to 1. So the lack of resources for counselors, for a counseling department, is a huge problem. And the reality is, I'm a big believer in a lot of the answers to challenges in education don't require rocket science. And I don't think the work that OneGoal is doing is rocket science, spoiler alert. I think that system, that structure itself is fundamentally flawed. And so, of course, it's going to continue to produce the results that it's producing. Our counselors are incredibly overwhelmed. There's not enough of them. Their caseloads are too broad. And they're responsible not just for post-secondary planning, but often socio-emotional support, often playing roles in IEP development. And that's just more than any human can manage. And so to think about how we leverage the vision and direction of a counselor and counselor's office, but really maximize their capabilities by incorporating more incredible adults and leaders who are already in the building, who care a lot about what happens to young people after they leave their classrooms, felt like the obvious solution.
Jean-Claude, you asked a great question that touches on an element of our flagship classroom model that, Melissa, you haven't mentioned yet, which is where we go about the matriculation and persistence aspect. So could you talk a little bit about that, bridging the gap between secondary, high school, and post-secondary college and training?
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it is such a critical component of our work that really also is a key differentiator that I'm a little disappointed in myself that I didn't reference yet. So first of all, Stephen, you're absolutely right to really hit on some of the just structural and again, I think systemically inequitable approaches to resourcing our schools. And the other component is really a challenge we see often in education, which is there's real breakdown between institutions. So our secondary institutions and our post-secondary institutions, often there's very little data sharing, not often a clear baton pass. We have, I think, a huge gap with how to support students, especially over the summer between high school and college, when they're not, the high school system no longer can support them because they're not, quote unquote, their students, and they're not yet college students. And so, the data around Summer Melt and how many students we lose is incredibly alarming. And so we needed to not just solve some of the challenges around how we're resourcing our advising in the secondary space, but also in particular through that transitional period. So so if you look at 100,000 young people who start ninth grade, what we were typically seeing when OneGoal was founded was that at the end, if we got to a place where 20,000 of them were ultimately, it made it to junior year of college, you would see that we lost about 80% of the students in 3 years, 11th grade, 12th grade, and the first year of post-secondary. And so that data actually became the guardrails for how we thought about our model, that it would be insufficient to only do work in 11th and 12th grade, knowing how many students we actually lose in 13th or 1 year after secondary. And so OneGoal's model is and has been a 3-year model where we're supporting students throughout a successful transition to ensure that there's a clear baton pass and that those early hurdles that they will inevitably face, they have the resources that they need to actually overcome them. And so we take full responsibility for our young people, not just because they're attending a specific institution, but because they're human beings who are moving between institutions. And that has been a critical component of why we've achieved the results that we've achieved. Quick aside, but I think it's an important and personal one for me. So I tell this story about Mrs. Jeter, and I think sometimes it's an overly simplistic, like she came in and lights switched and I lived happily ever after. But someday over drinks, I'll tell you the 18 million potholes I faced, even with Miss Jeter's support. I went to 5 different undergraduate institutions before I received a degree. It took me almost 6 years. And one of those hurdles, I was accepted ultimately into NYU, which was my dream school. I was a theater major and got a scholarship and was so excited. I thought I won the lottery. And my mom at the time had a part-time job at the airlines and got a $10 standby ticket for me to fly to New York to begin my freshman year at NYU. I landed in LaGuardia. I had $50 in my pocket. I hopped in a cab because I thought that that's what you do. Big mistake. Now, having been to New York several times, realized that the cab fare was more than the money I had no credit card, had no cell phone, in tears, 17, in a city by myself, begged the cab driver to take me back to the airport, and I went home and never enrolled in NYU. We are a 3-year model because that should not be happening to our young people, right? They should have someone to call. They should have someone who can advocate for them, who would have called NYU to make sure I got out of that car and into the front doors. But we didn't. And we need to ensure that our young people have consistent support. And sadly, the barriers between our institutional systems often prevent that.
Melissa, we can move on, but Eric asked a great question about leveraging teachers, like science teachers, for example, science teachers of color working in STEM, guiding students in their college and career planning journey specific to their field of expertise. And I think that we're going to touch on that a bit later when we get to our OneGoal Leadership Network. So thanks for that great question, Eric, and we look forward to answering it here shortly.
Yes, and I will say that's one of the beautiful things about this work is that, the folks who are advisors are math teachers, our science teachers, are in some cases PE teachers, are right. It's really exposing not just the students, but honestly, one of the things we hear that is a beautiful symptom of this work is that our educators are re-inspired and engaged, right? Because you get to think beyond the delivery of content. And you get to think about using all of your resources and expertise on investing in our kids, which is why most teachers teach. We know it's not for the money. It's to make a difference in the lives of our young people. And so we see our teachers often re-engaged, re-inspired in ways that they hadn't been by being activated in this way in our school systems. So, once we built this model and started to see real impact, there were a few critical milestones that really accelerated not just our reach, but how we innovated on this model. So we were incredibly lucky enough to be featured in Paul Tough's book, How Children Succeed, Chapter 4, in case you're curious, because what Paul learned by studying our program is that probably what should have been obvious, that yes, we cared a lot about the outcomes we were seeing in terms of enrollment, in terms of persistence. At that point, University of Chicago had done a rigorous external quasi-experimental evaluation and had proved out that our students were consistently enrolling and persisting at 10 to 20 percentage points above their peers. But what Paul Tough also illuminated is that we were seeing students benefit from the work we were doing in other ways, like less disciplinary action, less arrests, less engagement with the Chicago police, and higher attendance rates. And so all of these other outcomes that I think society cares a lot about, our students were continuing to outperform their peers. And the story that I think is important to highlight here is in some ways a simple one, a beautiful one, and a really important one, which is, we have a lot of challenges in our school system. I did not join OneGoal because I believe, quote unquote, college is the answer. However, when you're a young person and you want to be something when you grow up, you start coming to school. And I think sometimes we forget just how critical the construct of purpose is and having purpose for our young people. There was a really alarming survey that was done in Chicago Public Schools a little bit over a decade ago, where they asked our young people how old they thought they would be when they died. It's alarming data. The mode answer was 19. So that's really what we're up against, right? If you don't think you are going to live beyond 19, you certainly don't think you're going to be something when you grow up. So you're certainly not going to come to school, and you're certainly not going to fill out the FAFSA form. And so I do think it's really important to highlight how critical how children succeed. Paul Tufts' work, the work of University of Chicago was really helping understand why this model was so effective. Because I think at the time there was a lot of energy around technical solutions, like FAFSA, making FAFSA easier, which anybody who's in this space right now, we can have a whole other conversation about, which is part of the equation, but certainly not the most, I think, aware and student-centered orientation to what truly must be in place to have strong post-secondary outcomes. And I think that element of purpose is, if not more important than the outcomes itself, at least as important. I wanted to take a minute. This is a little bit of a humble brag, but when you tell the story of OneGoal, you can't miss this moment, because I do think there was a moment where who we are in this space completely shifted, and we owe that to President Barack Obama. So I will let him speak for himself.
Forward is to make sure your outstanding commitments mean something where it matters most, in the lives of young people. That's what Jeff Nelson, a former teacher who's here today, wanted to do. Where's Jeff? There he is, right here. I'm going to brag on Jeff for a second. 7 years ago, he co-founded a nonprofit called OneGoal, and it had one goal. And so it was aptly named: to help more low-performing, low-income high school students not only get into college, but make sure they've got continued support to succeed once they get to college. And one of their students is a young man from Chicago named Caleb Navarro. Is Caleb here too? Couldn't make it? Well, next time you got to bring him. But he'll hear about it, that I was talking about him. I'll bet he will. So by the time Caleb was a sophomore, he wasn't doing all that well in school. Wasn't motivated to try harder, starting to give up on himself. The folks at OneGoal saw a spark of something that was special in Caleb. Once he joined their program, he started to believe that maybe he was capable of achieving more. Expert teachers helped him focus on academics and taught him how to stick with his studies even when it was hard. Caleb started taking AP classes, something he wouldn't have imagined for himself a couple of years earlier. He gave up his lunch hour to take an extra class. Now that's serious, giving up your lunch hour. Started out with a GPA of 2.4, ended up with a 3.8 GPA. Today, Caleb is a freshman at Dominican University studying biochemistry, on track to graduate from college. And because of just some key interventions at a critical moment in his life, he's now studying stuff that I don't understand.
So
we can probably pause there.
Yeah, we'll pause there. Thanks, Stephen. So I love that I get to tell the rest of the story, and Stephen just included a link there for you all. So yeah, a lot of pressure for Caleb, who I know very, very well and I knew then as a college freshman, to have President Obama talking about you. Here's the reality. Caleb is now Dr. Caleb Navarro. He is working on a research team that is currently working on a cure for cancer. Yeah, incredible. And, you know, I know sometimes these anecdotes or these stories can, you know, they could be the warm, fuzzy parts of our work. But this is deeply, deeply personal for me because I knew Caleb when he was 18 and I know him now at 25. And the reality is Caleb, like me, I think would have been reflected on that leaky pipeline data differently, absent real investment in this young person. And again, it's not rocket science. There's not magic here. But if you talk to Caleb, he will directly attribute the outcomes that he's achieved, the milestones, to Drew Stricker, who thank God is on the OneGoal staff now, but his high school math teacher who supported him in a community of his peers for 3 years, junior year, senior year, freshman year of college, when it truly mattered most. But as you can imagine, getting this kind of press was a really important moment for OneGoal, because people started to ask, like, well, what is it? What is it about what's working here that we might be able to scale, not just in terms of ensuring more students have OneGoal, but actually are there insights here that you could do without OneGoal? And so it really pushed our thinking here. And so we started to look at some of these other outcomes, including that, you know, students on average were attending 5 more days of school a year, that we weren't just impacting post-secondary outcomes, but there was also an important story to tell about the high school outcomes that we were seeing. So our students were completing high school 16 percentage points higher than their peers. And so it became a broader conversation about, even if secondary school systems weren't tracking post-secondary outcomes or weren't feeling accountable to them, there was real benefit in orienting towards post-secondary outcomes because of the results that you were seeing on secondary. And so district leaders all across the country started paying attention, certainly in Chicago public schools. And big shout out to Jean-Claude at the time for really helping us reimagine then what it might look like to center secondary districts on post-secondary outcomes for their benefit, but also obviously for the long-term benefit of our students. We do certainly work with Posse. I saw that question come up, and other support programs. I will say though, OneGoal's model was really about addressing the gap that we saw in the students who were not on track to enroll and persist in a post-secondary program. And so typically we were looking for students who had somewhere between a 2.0 and a 3.0 GPA, and not always prioritizing students who had a 3.0 or above. So and especially in the early years, we're really focused on the students who really could benefit from intervention. And so yes, partners like Posse became really critical to us. And if you know their model, you know that, you know, typically the students who are in Posse are valedictorian, salutatorian, top 10% of their class. And we have a deep belief that whether it's college or in a post-secondary certification trade program, that every student needs an opportunity to have access to some education beyond grade 12. And so partnerships are really critical to us, but it is important that we are differentiating ourselves so that we're not only ensuring that the students who are already in the top 10% are ultimately successful in their collegiate career. Grateful that that work happens and is happening, but see those folks more as partners to us so that we can make sure that we're providing the right kind of support for all students, no matter their academic criteria. I'm going to keep us moving, but just wanted to share some of the outcomes that we were seeing. Again, I referenced the 10 to 20 percentage points. We are seeing that carry through to completion outcomes. And recently in 22, University of Chicago sort of revamped their research to both look earlier in the high school outcomes like attendance, like high school graduation, but also later to graduation. Next slide, please. So similar outcomes, again, that I think are just important. And again, the thing that I would highlight here, and this is, you know, when we talk about nonprofit work, sometimes we don't always talk about the business and the economic models behind this. But what we realized is that just by looking at the number of students who were attending high school more frequently and graduating high school on time, that if we could connect since so many of our schools are funded directly by their attendance formula, to the outcomes that we were achieving, you could see how actually by investing in this work, you were getting a return on that investment through funding in your attendance outcomes. And so this data became a really big aha for us, that we could continue to grow and scale our economic model with being less reliant on philanthropy and increasingly looking to district funding, to state funding as a way to fuel this work. Because at the end of the day, you are going to, as a school leader, increase your budget if more kids are coming to school. And this is an intervention where we were seeing we had decades now of proof that you would see a direct benefit to your bottom line. And so there's this construct that we actually just talked about with the Gates team recently, where so many education programs, nonprofits, have to make their programs CFO proof. Because you can have all the outcomes you'd like, but at the end of the day, if they can't figure out how to fund it, that's going to get to the CFO's desk, and it's not going to be something they invest in. And so it became really critical enabler for our future scale and growth to be able to connect our outcomes to the funding formulas at our schools and school districts. So, we continued to scale our program. I think like many other organizations had, sort of city by city, going from 1,000 students to 2,000 students to 3,000 students. Ultimately, we saw that from going to this after school model of 32 students, we were able to support more than 13,000 students across 6 major urban sites. And then we paused. And I think not just OneGoal paused, but I think a lot of nonprofits across our country paused because we realized 2 things. One, this sort of city by city brick and mortar expansion model will always be insufficient in actually addressing some of the systems level challenges that young people face in every school, every county, every state across our country. And if we're going to solve the challenges we've signed up to solve in our lifetime, this sort of linear growth model, I think we've all started to awaken to the idea that it will be insufficient. The other phenomenon that we were starting to see is that we want to be able to go where our kids go. And we were starting to see this drain of young people from large urban centers into college community or into collar communities, into suburbs. And so it really forced us to think about who we wanted to be for our young people across the country, and if this sort of city by city regional expansion model was going to be the long-term answer for us.
Melissa, this is kind of backtracking slightly about the impact with CPS specifically, and how CPS's Office of Post-Secondary Advising was sort of established in concert with our work. And I'm sure Jean-Claude is no stranger to some of these milestones that we're highlighting, but if you just wouldn't mind touching quickly on that.
Yeah, Jean-Claude, I feel like you're going to kick me under the table at some point here, but I couldn't let this presentation go by without really giving you some credit here, because this isn't just a OneGoal story. It is a result of some collective action that was happening and some incredible leadership that was happening at the time. And so 3 really important milestones that I want to call out, because it does then start to shift us to why we are now in the business of systems change and no longer merely scaling a program, but have our eyes set on transforming post-secondary advising across the country. And it's a result of some of the work of others. And actually, if you can go back, Stephen, just once, I would want to name a couple enablers, because I think this is the part of this work that I wish we talked about more in nonprofit leadership impact at scale. Because if there are not enabling conditions for scale, you can only get so far. And there were 3 really important enablers for us. So first, collaborating on the CPS scorecard alongside then CEO Jean-Claude Brizard to add enrollment and persistence metrics for junior and senior year and through college, helped to see our as secondary school leaders look beyond attendance and high school graduation to longer term outcomes. Such an important enabler for this work. There has to be incentives. We're human beings, and the behaviors and practices that we enact ultimately are what influence outcomes. And if you want to change behaviors and practices, you have to create the right incentive structure to be able to do that. And we were able to do that in the city of Chicago. In 2013, CPS launched an office college and career center. And so putting real talent, real capacity, real resources, and ensuring that actually at the student level, there was a similar incentive, integrating a Learn Plan, Succeed plan as a high school graduation, said to our young people that just going to class and getting a grade is not the destination, that you actually have to have a plan for what happens next in order to meet all the requirements of graduation. Now, that didn't work out perfectly, and there were lots of implementation challenges that I won't bore you with, but I do think it was an important step forward that allowed us to see some of the outcomes we're seeing across the system. And then last but not least, Jeff Nelson, my predecessor, was involved in a group that worked on ensuring that college enrollment and persistence metrics were actually part of the school quality rating policy, which we called SQRP, which is evaluating school performance tied to things like performance reviews, bonus structure, et cetera. And so those systems level enablers, I think, are just such an important part of ultimately seeing lasting change across our system. So I referenced this earlier, but all of this made us realize that, just going from 13,000 students to 14,000 students to 18,000 students can't be the goal. That's not the thing that personally would get me out of bed in the morning. But we were starting to see a path to actually being able to transform the way post-secondary advising and support happens across our country. And so we went from this mission statement that was about sort of closing the degree divide one kid at a time, to really transforming post-secondary advising and support, and that prompted us to do very different work. So just a couple pieces of context that I think are important for all of us who are in the business of scaling organizations to be considerate of. We talked to our community members before our last strategic plan and really figured out what is it that we're doing that is working, what might it look like to transform post-secondary advising in your system, and then what do you need from us? And a few things really came out of that data. One was just scale, right? That at the end of the day, if we're serving 30 students in a classroom, it is going to be a drop in the bucket when we think about the 1.4 million 11th graders from low-income communities who start 11th grade each year and then receive 38 minutes of advising. And so when we think about just the scope of the challenge, we knew direct service would be a very limiting answer. We also heard that flexibility is critical and key in achieving impact at scale. That really ease of partnership for schools, making sure that you're meeting them where they are, knowing that their needs are not all the same. It meant that if this isn't about just copy and paste of a program or practice, but really being able to work differently in different contexts. And then last but not least, we really heard that some elements of this work required deeper change, mindset change, resource change, capability development. And so again, implementing a program we were going to see was going to be insufficient, given what some of our system leaders were set up against and some of the barriers that would prevent them from being able to implement best practices. So these factors really influence where we went next. And so now when we talk about OneGoal, we no longer call ourselves a course or a program. We talk about ultimately being part of a broader movement to transform post-secondary advising, and we have 3 levers to do that work. The first is the one I spent the most time on, direct impact. We believe that there should and will always be a role that we can play in ensuring that more students ultimately get access to high quality advising experience through the OneGoal 3-year model. And so we're going to continue to do that work, and we're expanding those efforts in many of the cities that we're currently in and many new cities across the country. We also recognized, however, that there's a wider spread solution that's required that is more cost effective and really gets at some of the structural reasons why advising is so difficult. So I asked a principal in Iowa, what would it mean to transform post-secondary advising in your school? And he said, Melissa, it's really simple. There needs to be more advising. And when it happens, it needs to be high quality. That's it. And so the spirit of that feedback and that insight really led us to One Goal Essentials. What would it look like to spend some time in a district building the capacity of educators, adults across that entire building to ensure that high quality post-secondary advising was happening more frequently, and that when it was happening, it was strong. And so that's not quite the One Goal course, but it is in many ways taking the most essential and effective parts of the course and enabling a school system to leverage things like advisory period, like study hall, to do this kind of work. And then last but not least, our systems impact work. So for the last 4 years, we've been implementing One Goal Leadership Network across the entire state of Illinois, across the entire state of Kentucky, really equipping superintendents, district leads, counselor teams, college and career offices on a multi-year coaching solution that allows for them to build the necessary and hopefully enduring conditions to change the way advising is happening across their institutions. So this is who One Goal is today and what we're doing. I'll spend a few more minutes here before I switch to questions, and just cognizant of time, but in about 5 minutes, we're going to open it up just for dialogue. So you can ask me questions, push our thinking, share insights from your work. But I wanted to offer this frame and share just a little bit more about what that work looks like. This is the newest work for us, but in some ways it's the most exciting. So I love this quote. We'll go back. We'll just feature this quote because I do think it's important to hear directly from some of the leaders who have been doing this work. So terms like system or even collective and collective impact let individuals off the hook. We must break these big ideas down to the fundamental reality that success comes down to people, investors, practitioners, and policymakers who work to improve the lives of children and families by changing what they do to achieve shared goals. I wanted to bring this up because increasingly One Goal is actually becoming an expert in implementation science. There are mandates now in a good way, I think, all across the country that prioritize post-secondary outcomes and post-secondary planning. But in many ways, it doesn't get to the actual specific behaviors of individuals in those systems and how those need to change. And so we see ourselves playing a really important role in this sector in helping the folks who are ultimately the rubber's going to hit the road feel well equipped to leverage the resources, the mandates, the tools that they have, but to do so with excellence. And I think that that's an aspect of systems change that we often get right, or that we often get wrong in our sector, and thought it was brilliant that Jeff Edmondson, really thought about how we think about collective impact through the lens of individual action. We'll skip the next slide. I just wanted to, this will be in, we'll send this deck along, obviously, but just wanted to acknowledge that that's not the way our current system operates. And we're still seeing incredible inequities in terms of where resources are going, how work is being funded and prioritized, which is part of the reason why the One Goal Leadership Network is so critical, because at the end of the day, we all know it takes real resources and real vision and strategy to pull this work off. And so we spend a lot of time in the early stages of our One Goal Leadership Network, just creating that alignment across our systems. So our school districts go through this process of ultimately creating a diagnosis. So being able to assess their post-secondary readiness capabilities across 6 different dimensions in their system. They build tailored plans that become true change management plans. We provide expert one-on-one coaching, and then ultimately build communities of practice across districts so that they can share these ideas, which a lot of our districts tell us is one of the biggest benefits. Is so often the work of post-secondary planning, support, mentorship becomes this isolating and isolated work that is happening outside of the curricular experience. And so reconnecting folks to share ideas, to share best practices, to learn from one another is a really important component.
Melissa, I do just want to pause really quickly because you're touching on something that addresses a question in our chat, which is balancing the tension between being flexible. So making sure that it's easy for schools to adopt, but also accomplishing real systems change in the same vein. And I thought maybe you could talk about how in that assessment process, and we're doing the diagnostic, there's sort of like a menu of focus areas that we allow schools to sort of pick and choose from through our guidance, through our support. So it's not just like a one-size-fits-all plan.
I mean, you answered it better than I could, but it is funny. I will say, as an organizational leader, you just like, I am having PTSD from, you know, this innovation process that we went through, where we really did have to grapple with wanting to be everything to every district and wanting to be really responsive and a good partner and flexible, but then that not being efficient or effective because we would have 100 different ways of working with schools. And so I think it's Malcolm Gladwell. I hope I'm not misquoting that, but he has a chapter where he talks about you know, it's not about identifying what the best ketchup is. It's about identifying the best ketchups, or it's not about identifying what the best soda is. It's about the best sodas. So that like the basic, what he was trying to articulate is that there's not one answer, but there also is not a million. There's like 5, right? Like, and we use that construct to say, listen, we can't be in the business of customization for every district and their needs, but what we can do is recognize that districts are in different phases of this work. And so some are in the stage of vision and strategy development, some are in the stage of capabilities building, some are in the stage of goal set, right? And so what we've done is we've aligned around about 6 areas for improvement that districts then have the opportunity to choose between, so that we're not exhausting ourselves as an organization with our limited resources, but really focusing on the most high impact and research backed practices, which has been a journey for us to really try and hone in on. I'm going to give you a second just to hear from one of our school leaders before we open it up for conversation. Again, just to bring some different voices in the room and hear a little bit more firsthand of what this work has looked like.
We had some holes in our strategy for ensuring that students had a solid footing for their post-secondary goals. And we didn't have a lot of resources or human or actual monetary resources in order to organize all of that. We definitely would not have had champions for it in terms of taking ownership for it. And we were very siloed in our approach regarding helping students in school. There was not a strong approach to counseling, and the counselor being the leverage point for students to be able to know what to do to get to a post-secondary place. I think that was probably one of the things that stood out to me. Again, not a real strong champion at the district level who would be able to organize all of that. And also just a differing approach from school to school and differing approaches to counseling school to school that, just left it up to chance if a student wanted to pursue XYZ goal after post-secondary. It was just very up to chance.
So I wanted to offer, Proviso is a district that is near and dear. It's literally 5 minutes from the high school I attended. I played them when I was a high school athlete. And so it felt really special to see the impact that OneGoal was having at a systems level at Proviso for me personally. But really the insight here that I think has been so impressive is when we started to do the work of systems change, I can tell you everybody told me it was a bad idea. That, you have something that works, continue to refine it, don't lose focus, you have limited resources, and it's slow. Systems change is slow and it's hard. And all of that stuff is right. And they were good warnings. However, the part that I now can say as a result of having done this work alongside of our colleagues for several years is that while all that is true, What people don't realize is that when you do make change at deeper layers into the institution, the actual swing of the impact that you can have, the magnitude of the impact is massive, more than I could have ever imagined. So when we're supporting students directly, are we seeing more of them graduate and ultimately go on to career? Yes, that's exciting. But when we started to actually address challenges deeper into the system, within a very short amount of time, we were seeing things like FAFSA and completion rates increase 10 percentage points. High school graduation increased 5 percentage points, right? That massive improvements in, I mean, we're talking handful of years of work as a result of just addressing some of the problems deeper into the institution. You can skip the next slide, Stephen. We'll just go to just some of the other outcomes that we've seen. Next one. One more. Yes, so this is what we're seeing in some of our systems level work. So we're seeing impact on FAFSA completion, on 9th grade on track, on attendance, on CTE participation, on high school graduation, and on the access and completion of early college coursework. And so we've really centered on these outcomes as what we look to now to see is the district change happening? Is it enduring? And truly, when we started to break down even the magnitude of these outcomes, we were seeing things like in 8 out of 12 of the districts we were working with in Illinois in their second year, we saw double the FAFSA completion improvements relative to schools in the same area that we weren't working with. And so huge outcome from relatively small effort. And I say that, and I feel like my team would roll their eyes because it's really hard work, really hard work. But knowing that we had done this kind of work for 15 years prior and not seen that kind of systems level improvement told us that we were onto something. So I'm going to close us out here and open it up for dialogue with just a few headlines. Stephen, you can go back, just a few insights that I think have come up in the chat or have been reflected back, that truly, this is all hands work. It's about individuals as much as it is about systems, and over-indexing on one or the other doesn't really address some of the core nature of these challenges. That it is a long game, that it does take time, that it is complex and does require us as an organization to take big swings. I called Chancellor of City Colleges, who sits on my board, the night before we were making a contract with the Illinois State Board of Education to serve 30 districts. And I called him fearfully and said, I don't know if we should do this. This is terrifying. It's going to push us in all sorts of ways and we might fail. And he said, nonprofits exist to take big swings at big problems. There's more risk in you not doing this. And so I think it's a charge that I take personally, and I wish more of us would. That at the end of the day, we have to consistently center on data and what's happening, both through the lens of outcomes, but honestly as a way to build an economic model that actually is sustainable for our schools and school systems. And true integration is key. This work cannot happen on the outskirts of the system, but has to really leverage the existing talents and capabilities that already exist within the system. And so with that, I would love to spend the last 15 minutes together just in dialogue, hearing your reflections, answering any questions that have come up that we haven't yet addressed.
Melissa, I think you've mostly addressed questions from the chat, but I'm going to throw a couple at you that we didn't quite touch on. But April had a great question about the role of alumni. And so I think there's a few things we could point to in terms of our student summit work, our new Office of Fellow Engagement, and just bringing alumni sort of back into the conversation. We've got some other anecdotes about alumni serving on boards. I don't know if there's any other things you would point to.
Yeah, so I love where you actually did that last comment. It is really critical that we have alumni on our boards. And so I have on my national board, one of our alum is my boss, Robert Armins Jr. That's critical. And, you heard even just the beginning of our story that our young people who were Silas Purnell students actually were our key initial advisors on all of our curriculum work. So there's just a deep belief that student voice and student experience matters a ton here, and there are no better student voices than people who've actually experienced our program. So there's a sort of, I think, mindset there that's really critical. And I think the other part of our work is that, you know, this was never the intent, but there is an interesting phenomenon that our OneGoal students become mini advisors to their cousins, to their neighbors, to their friends. They are often the ones who are like literally reteaching OneGoal advising sessions to their peers, which has been such a fascinating phenomenon to observe, not something that we intentionally tried to create. But I do think there's some power there that we haven't totally tapped into yet to figure out, like, what could that army of collective alumni that now are in the many of thousands, how could they really continue to lead this effort, and not just as sort of recipients, but as influencers? And I think that's a question we're gonna have to grapple with into the future.
And John had another question about what that Y3 looks like. So year 1 is the junior year 2 is our senior year. And this is, again, back to our flagship sort of classroom model. But then there's that critical year 3 where that teacher from their high school sticks with them through their first year of post-secondary. Can you talk just really quickly about what that work looks like?
Yeah, so again, not rocket science, but sadly, I think we would all, I'm sure the vast majority of us, when we entered college, didn't know what a bursar was, as an example, right? I gotta love that we call things these cryptic, confusing names. But I use that as an example because the reality is there is an algorithm for success in post-secondary. It's just a hidden algorithm, right? You need to know who the bursar is. You need to check your bill. You need to check your account. You need to do so frequently. You need to make sure that you have the right amount of credits. You need to get advising before you actually register for classes. You need to ensure that you maintain the appropriate number of credits to continued financial aid. If you get on satisfactory academic progress warning, SAP, there's a set of things that you need to do. There are rules that you have to follow. But the sad thing is no one is out here making them explicit or clear to our young people. And so much of our curriculum throughout that first year is just that. It's like translating this brand new language of adulthood and higher education to our young people. Now, very practically, what that means is that program director, who was a high school teacher who supported that student for 2 years, checks in with their young people on a set of milestones minimally every 6 weeks. Minimally, and truly that's like we see them chat way more often than that, and so that is a key component of that third year model.
Melissa, this has been amazing. Thank you. I was going to call on Eric Ben. I think he had to leave because a lot of this is happening in Dallas. I think he needs your help. We're texting back and forth, frankly, in the discussion. So unless someone has a burning question, I was going to put Isabel on the spot here, who was thinking about this kind of work. Isabel used to be with me at the Gates Foundation, and she's thinking about this now across an entire state of Washington. So if you want to say anything, if not, anyone else can actually jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, this was a lot of food for thought. I think a couple of things that resonated with me given our strategy. So just as background, my name is Isabel Munoz-Colon. I'm a senior program officer on the Washington State team at the Gates Foundation. We are the home team. We like to call the team that was originally founded by Bill Sr. And so we have a long legacy of working in place, being and knowing what it means to be in partnership with our grantees in the work that we do. And right now, our big focus is around that high school to post-secondary transition. Right now, in the latest data, only 50% of our students who graduate from high school go on to a post-secondary degree. When you look at Latino students who I have a particular interest in for many reasons, that percentage is about 40%. And that has been on the decline for many years, even before COVID. And so we're sort of in a bit of a crisis, I think, here. And part of what's really interesting about what you presented, two fronts. One is like, this is not we're not going to program our way out of this. I heard I was talking to one of our presidents of our higher ed institutions who we were meeting with school districts and these partners in that region, talking about, what are we going to do collectively together to address this issue. And I think, we have oftentimes just defaulted to, like, if we just do this one program, that's going to solve all of these issues. And we really need to think about not just the proof points. We do need proof points. We do need to understand, like, how on the ground does this work? But then what do you learn from that then gets you push for and changes at both at the district and that district and higher institution level, at the regional level, but also like what needs to happen at the state level to make the path, easier for our counselors, our principals, our students, our families to transition. And so I think that piece, like learning more about what you are learning in this space, would be hugely valuable to us. So that I'll just say that. I don't know, Jean-Claude, if that's what you meant.
And rumor has it,
I was like doing this. My camera was off, but I was just like, whoa, like this is really exciting.
Fun fact, I think our teams are talking, or are at least planning on talking, because Washington has come up a lot. And so yes, more on that. I will say, that I have this quick anecdote. My predecessor, he used to do his pitch, and he's like one of the best in the world. He just is like so eloquent and heart and head and all the things. I had big shoes to fill. But he would often start with, OneGoal is a course. And I would be like, stop saying that. Like, it's not a course. Like, we work not because it's like a class that students take. It's about grounding students in purpose, investing adults in their big questions about what their future looks like, resourcing it, ensuring that quality advising is taking place. And honestly, even now I look back, I didn't know that I was being insightful then. I just thought I was being snarky. But now I look back and I'm like, yeah, but we need to be in the business of like not scaling programs, but scaling what is working about them. Because that is what I think you can ultimately institutionalize, right? You can't institutionalize OneGoal course. If everybody wanted OneGoal tomorrow, we couldn't deliver that. But do we know what it takes to integrate post-secondary advising into the school experience? We do, and that is scalable.
I think you see your hand came up and went back down.
It did, and I'll just ask a quick question, Melissa. I've fangirled over OneGoal for a very long time, so appreciate you having you here. I just have a question just in terms of your perspective. So OneGoal, and it's going post-secondary, oftentimes college. Now there's a lot of conversation about kind of going right to industry, training students in schools. Kind of what's your perspective on kind of the not college path or the other pathways? And do you all kind of think about that, consider it, or just where do you kind of sit in that space with those conversations happening?
Yeah, so we're very much for a long time bachelor or bust. And when I came to OneGoal, I was all about it, because I was like, I know that's not what worked for me. So and I know that's the difference between me and my siblings who are still struggling paycheck to paycheck. It's my degree. So I didn't want to be a hypocrite. And so very much as bachelor or bust. And then I had to eat some humble pie, because we surveyed our students and we said, what do you want for yourselves? And their aspirations were more diverse, and increasingly so over time. And so I said, well, if we're going to be about it, we need to change our mission to center on our students' greatest post-secondary. What do they want for themselves? And so often what I feel like a role that I hope I can play in this sector is shifting the conversation from an adult conversation to a student conversation. What do our young people want for themselves? And let's deliver on that. Let's stop getting distracted about the holier than thou. It must happen this way. This is the answer I believe for kids. What do kids want for themselves? What we can do is we can really equip them, and not take these like sort of universal stances, but like equip them with the data, the information about here's what career pathways exist. Here's what those career pathways require, and be honest with them about that. Share the information openly. One of my favorite equity leaders in the country, Dr. Tim Rennick at Georgia State University, who's just incredible. He tells this story that he sits on our Atlanta board, but one of the first purchases he made at Georgia State was he bought 2 screens for every counselor. And he's like, yeah, nobody cared at the time, but let me tell you why I did that, because I believed in equity of information. And we don't even realize how often the information is facing the adult and not facing the kid. I wanted 2 screens so that in every advising session, the kid was looking at the same information that the adult was. It's so beautiful, right? There's something so simple and beautiful about that. And so that's the orientation I take personally in terms of my values, is I think we can't pretend like we know it all as adults. Our economy is changing so quickly. We don't know what the world's going to look like with AI. I can't pretend like I know what the answer is going to be for our young people. What I care about is that they are deeply invested in their pathway, because if they don't have that, nothing else matters. If they don't want the degree, then who cares? They're not going to stick it through. So it takes, I think, a different orientation to some of these conversations. I believe in the data. I will fight anybody that a bachelor's degree still matters in our country and all the data supports it. So like, let's not have a silly conversation about your opinion versus mine. But I also think it's really, really important that we listen to our young people and what they want for themselves.
Awesome.
Wow,
I think
I
we're coming
appreciate
up.
that.
Sorry, Akila, thank you. I think we're coming up on time. Really grateful. We didn't get to introduce everyone to everyone else, but I'm really grateful for you, all of you guys, to give up your time to be here. And I know some of you guys are really busy, like John, Tammy, and others, Isabel, and Melissa. Again, you and Stephen, thank you so very much for this. I know many more folks are going to be watching this via recording. Thank you, and I'll see you soon in Chicago.
Thank you for the opportunity. Glad to do this.
Bye, y'all.
Well.